If you focus on it just as a purely technical problem, then yeah, it's a trap. Basically, you're focusing on the wrong thing. And that's why, with Speckle, and this is coming from all the way back in like UCL and my PhD time, like whatever, you can solve for technical problems, but that's not going to be enough. Like what the aim is essentially is making sure that the data that I produce, the designs that I produce are understandable by the other party, by the other stakeholders, right? And being able to translate from one conceptual model to another, from one mental model, to another, I think that's the important part.
Have you ever had to export the same model 5 different ways just to get everybody on the same page? Today on Buildings 2.0, I'm joined by Dimitri Stefanescu, founder and CEO of Speckle Systems, the open source platform helping teams understand their building data. We dive into 3 big ideas. Number 1, why trying to make every tool talk to each other is actually a trap. It slows us down, and how real collaboration starts with trust, not necessarily integrations and exports. 2, how Dimitri keeps Speckle open source and community driven while still running a profitable, sustainable business. And 3, what a world without file exports could look like, where building data lives in one place where everyone can see, search, and use it instantly. If you're an architect, designer, or builder who's ever wrestled with broken files or siloed data, you'll get a lot out of this one. Let's start. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I have a really special guest, Dimitri Stefanescu, founder and CEO of Speckle Systems. Dimitri, thanks for joining.
Jose, thanks for having us. Well, me, sorry, I shouldn't use the royal plural anyway.
Anyway,
Yes.
you represent the broader Speckle team. I'm
Exactly.
excited. So I'm going to get right into it. So one of the things you said really stuck out to me. Interoperability is a trap. For those that maybe don't live in the weeds of, BIM software, basically means, making sure that all of our tools talk to each other. It's been one of the biggest challenges, I think, in the industry for some time. And what it ends up looking like is just an infinite amount of file exports, imports, plugins that only work half the time. You've argued that instead of patching these broken systems, that it's actually a trap. How is it a trap?
Well, it's a trap because I think for a long while we focused essentially like basically as an industry, or maybe as like, let's say, digital talent within that industry, we focused on it as purely as a technical problem, right? Where actually what I argue is like it's much more around like a communication and process problem. It's a thing about creating trust between people and, making sure you trust your builder and that your builder trusts you, and that the GC trusts its manufacturers and its suppliers and so on. And it's not about essentially, I can't get my DWGs perfectly fitting inside my Revit file, right? Purely solving for a technical issue kind of made us overlook a lot of the social aspect of AEC and like how design is being worked on, how people are working on it, and like all the stakeholders, their feelings, their various things that they optimize for. As a former architect, I optimize for cool shit, in short. But obviously, when I go and talk with, a contractor like Besics or something like that, they would optimize for something else, right? Like their definition of cool would be different than my definition of cool. And obviously, this is compounded because when we can't exchange like designs, or when interoperability sucks, like getting to a shared understanding of what cool is, like what you think is cool and what I think is cool. Like if we talk about it, we'll reach a good point, right? We'll find a shared definition of what cool is. But if we can't really communicate because all my data is locked in Revit and you don't have Revit on your computer, like we're just going to talk at cross ends, right? That's kind of maybe unpacking of the trap around interoperability.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding this correctly, tell me why I'm wrong, but is it because of the forces that are kind of pulling to one side or the other? So you've got the kind of the open source community, you've got, closed source, and everyone's kind of pulling in their own directions. I mean, by definition, is this just, when you say it's a trap, it's kind of a losing battle in that sense? And we need to rethink it?
Pretty much so. I would say so. Like, I mean, if you focus on it just as a purely technical problem, then yeah, it's a trap. Basically, you're focusing on the wrong thing. And that's why, with Speckle, and this is coming from all the way back in like UCL and my PhD time, like whatever, you can solve for technical problems, but that's not going to be enough. Like what the aim is essentially is making sure that the data that I produce, the designs that I produce are understandable by the other party, by the other stakeholders, right? And being able to translate from one conceptual model to another, from one mental model, to another. I think that's the important part. Why it's problematic right now in the industry, like that's a whole kind of different set of, let's say, political questions that we may or may not want to get into, like the vendor ecosystem and like how everybody wants to own all the data. Customer ends up like, everybody but the customer ends up owning their own data. So yeah.
And I can't help but to ask, and I'm sure I'm not the first one to ask, but you, Speckle, the community, I think, the reason why so many developers, I think, rallied around was this kind of open source, ethos around it. How do you think about what stays open, and then how do you productize something? So, right, you're ultimately building a business, and you've got to make some. What framework do you use to think about that?
Correct. Like initially, when I made Speckle open source from like, I don't know, this is back 2017 or something like this. It was like purely, I thought from a very simple framework, my research was funded from public money. And I thought, I should give that back somehow. So, slap the MIT license on all of Speckle and let's go. There's positive externalities and negative externalities that kind of hit you when you have something that's open source, right? You get a lot of contributions, you win hearts and minds. And then at the same time, it also enables us as a company to have like a, let's say, core value proposition that is very difficult to match by others, whereby to all our customers, we go and say like, look, if we're ever going to piss you off, like you can self-host your own Speckle server and basically like everything you have it there and you can just tell us to fuck off. And that's it. End of the story. So it helps us kind of build a very good relationship there, like across, let's say, customers, users, and so on. There's also been, as you said, like building a company is not easy, especially in AEC and around an open source project. So what we've also been doing is like also like around our open source core have been building like what we call a proprietary crust. So there are like things such as, I don't know, Speckle Intelligence, which is like this whole new, let's say, AI and dashboarding layer that we're building on top of data inside Speckle. That's like not yet open source. That's available purely to our enterprise customers, right? So there are these things that we can do, and we're trying to walk that fine line of like, we want to leave enough value on the table for everybody to enjoy and to like kind of like uplift the industry on all fronts, but at the same time, make sure that we're not being taken advantage of. And this last part has been actually the most difficult one because you can't control it.
Yeah. What do you find that structurally, the ambition of staying open source versus the business pressures that any business faces, are they just in constant battle with each other? I ask because, most notably with OpenAI, right? Like I think it was just in the news about a few days ago that they're formally moving from non-for-profit to a for-profit. And it started with this ambition, but then I assume over time through a variety of different pressures, kind of changed their approach. Is that just an inherent tension that will always be true?
Yes and no. So I think if you set things up correctly, I mean, there is a tension, right? So like if things would have been closed source, then it would have been a simple story, right? This tension would not exist. But once you have that promise, like it is maybe like a more difficult battle that you like set yourself up for. So there is definitely a tension there. And I think where that tension is coming, but it's always like, in each company's case, I think it's very particular, right? So there's been like classic journeys out there, like Sentry.io is this error monitoring software. Like it went through a classic journey of like, we're very open source. Then we're like, hey, we're not that open source anymore, to like, now we're like focusing back on our open source community. Elasticsearch did the same thing. They were basically eaten alive by AWS. So like AWS was just like offering them as part of their cloud system. And then, Elastic would see nothing back. They went essentially closed source. Now they've reached a deal with AWS and now things are good. They're going back to essentially like a pure open source model. So there are these tensions, and it's not kind of like a fixed point in time that you can say, yeah, now we're open source, now we're no longer open source. We know essentially we leave a lot of value on the table. We're still happy for that to be there. We do, like at Speckle, we are annoyed. Like we have sometimes like some examples of like, come on, don't do this, right? Where it's like, companies just taking, hosting, basically abusing and copy pasting the interesting parts and essentially contributing nothing back. In recent years, like I'll be open, like it's been a bit more difficult to kind of like say, okay, yes, let's maintain that positive open source energy because of essentially the negative externalities that started kind of manifesting. Such is life, right?
Well, I guess as a proxy in AEC, IFC, I get to continue adding more acronyms for, unfortunately,
yes,
technical listeners, but IFC has kind of become the proxy for open source. And yet you've talked about this kind of like post file world where we're not kind of
Yeah.
thinking about the world in files. Talk to me about that. Like, what replaces the IFC? If the IFC is going to be replaced as kind of this file format, like what does that future look like?
I think like IFC 5. Sorry. So I think that was half a jest. I think there's like, when data is locked in a file, I think kind of the biggest thing that you lose is that it's very difficult for you to query it. Like if you are a large owner or even, I don't know, a large contractor or like whatever, even a large architecture company, you have 100 Revit files or 100 IFC files. Now you want to see like across all these projects, where did I use kind of this type of door? Just simple stuff, right? And how did it work out? If all that data, if all those designs are locked in a file, then you need like some way to take those files and transform them into data so that you can query them, right? And this is actually the core value proposition of Speckle. It's like, yeah, you can have your files, but we'll take those files, we'll basically dump them in a glorious database that you can query, access, view, etc. Now, IFC itself defines the shape of that data, right? So basically, just like how Revit defines its own shape of its data, like IFC defines its own shape of its data. And it's always a bit problematic, but it's easy. This is what we make easy, like in Speckle, is like kind of to straddle these abstractions and to be able to say like, yeah, I want to see all these doors from this project. Okay, cool. That's easy. Doesn't matter if they're coming from an IFC file or a Revit file. And this is the post-file world that I would want us to live in. And it's more about, anyway, I can keep on ranting around like, who defines what and so on, and why things like IFC are rather difficult to work out from basic principles, but I don't want to go there yet.
Right. Well, I mean, but to continue on this thread, continuing kind of the who, I want to continue straddling this tension between both the ambition and the business. You're building a business. You ultimately have to start somewhere by productizing something and then selling into something. On the one hand, you're talking about the value of data broadly benefiting everyone, from architects to owners and everyone in between. The reality is you have to sell into someone. Today, who are those people advocating for your product, as well as like how is that kind of expanding, if at all?
Yeah, it's been a journey on that as well. So like originally Speckle was a very technical product. So kind of the people, like our champions, were computational designers, data scientists embedded within AC companies, right? These were the people actually pushing the Speckle way forward in a sense. As we grew and as we kind of kept on spreading, it came, and you can judge us for being immature, but it came as a bit of a shock. Like suddenly, there's project managers that don't know anything about all this digital stuff, right? Like interfacing with Speckle for the first time. And by God, we're like failing them massively, right? Like it's like a whole new user persona. It's like a whole new, like what does that person need to be successful? What is their kind of like, sugar rush? What's the sugar rush for a project manager is kind of different from, the sugar rush that a computational designer would get or like a data scientist would get, right? So for us, I think that's increasingly a challenge because, there is a data, like Speckle, it's a data layer. Okay. Now on top of this data layer, there's like several value propositions, like interoperability is one of them. Like you get data in and out of authoring tools, but then there's business intelligence. Then there's like stuff like, hey, you can train AI on top of that data if you really want to, and these are all requires us to stay quite nimble when we're talking to people. Hey, okay, this guy's a CIO and this CIO knows his shit. He's been a former technical person. So, okay, like we can geek out, right? Or now we're entering in the territory of like, okay, this guy is an owner. They just want results. They want to see like, what's the impact? How can they mitigate risk on their ongoing projects? Okay, that's a different story. They don't care about AI, right? This is something that I love about this industry. Like you don't need to sell much, like FOMO. Yeah.
Right. All right. What does anything stand out in terms of like like an unusual use case that over the years stood out to you of either using Speckle? It's like how they use it in a way you didn't expect.
Wow, quite continuously. Like every year, there's a new amazing use case that comes out, right? The last one that now I can say off the top of my head, like someone built like a custom application around like managing security doors in like large whatever data center projects. And this was like I had no idea that actually managing security and access in this like high value buildings is such a thing, but it made complete sense, right? Like these guys, they needed to basically bridge the gap between like the security guard that walks around that knows like, okay, this corner is like not covered by like a security camera yet properly. Can we move it there? And then the previous setup was like they would need to pair up a Revit engineer because they'd have their model in there. And, the Revit engineer, like the draftsman, together with that guy, they would sit and fiddle and like kind of update the security devices across like floors of a building, right?
Right.
That's a very inefficient way of doing things. And then like one of our customers, like they built an app that's actually like kind of, it's in browser, like it can talk to the security guy, like with his own language and problem solved, right? So there's that. There's embedded carbon calculators that keep showing up. We're also like making some. So we've seen people using Speckle's viewer to basically like just go on site and like there's a little commenting functionality that we had that was initially like just launched as a technical demo, but they were within those comments, they were taking pictures and they were basically tracking as built versus what's on site, what's in the model, which was something that back then, this is I think a year and a half ago, or when did we see this? Like back then, it was something that we never really thought it's going to happen. This was just a technical POC we put out. So that's kind of one of the beautiful parts of our community, that we keep on finding out about these super cool use cases that we'd never have thought about us doing.
Yeah. One of the things that keeps me up at night quite a bit is, I think about often what it takes to digitize buildings and bring them online at scale. So the challenge of like when is the right triggering event for us to be able, in our case, to be able to kind of scan, model the space. We notice that there's a pattern around when an owner will acquire a building. They often just have no idea what they're about to acquire, so they need to digitize the space. Or when they're about to renovate and turns out that the as-built or plans are inaccurate or out of date, so they need to, refresh. In your case, what use cases, like when are people starting with Speckle, and what are you seeing are some of the downstream impacts? Can I assume that the primary case is when there's some sort of new project or renovation, or is that
basically? Yeah, throughout the design process, there are these moments where people need to engage with stakeholders that don't have access to Revit, right? And actually, what we're finding out now is that for all, let's say, like data is the future, blah blah blah, all the kind of high level philosophy that's backing Speckle, like that doesn't matter that much because people, I mean, it matters long term, don't get me wrong, but people engage with us. They just, want to walk into a room with essentially like a 3D model to show to their clients, like, hey, this is the latest design. This is what we've done. And then it starts evolving from there. Like then they say, okay, look, this has been what's been going on from A to B, from now to then. Like you've requested this change. This is the latest version. That's the previous version. We've had to change all these things. And this is when they start walking into that meeting room with essentially like dashboards that help them tell essentially a data-driven narrative, because this is kind of what ultimately design sometimes boils down to. You have to tell a nice story with the visuals, but you also have to back it up with like, we value engineered these things and so on. But that simple initial moment of engagement is like, people just want to see their model in a browser in 3D, and then they realize they can share it with others.
Yeah. Have you formed an opinion one way or the other about like the actual visualization of space? When we talk about BIM, we can talk about either the 3D aspect, of course, 2D views, or like the ones and zeros. Have you formed an opinion around like what accounts for just the best visualization techniques, so that ideally those kind of non-technical users that you're referring to, the project managers that likely don't want to spend their and Revit or otherwise, how do we broaden the tent a little bit to include, outside of just computational designers or BIM managers, like how do we broaden the tent for folks?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think, back in the day, there was this like big FOMO and like, 3D is the future, 3D is everything. And everybody forgot about 2D for a while, right? But 2D is a extremely valuable abstraction, right? Like when you think, even like for an architect, when you think, you a lot of the time you can just think in 2D because that's a good place to control a building, right? When you essentially, you scan a building, but I think as you mentioned it, like you deliver plans as well, right? You don't deliver just a 3D model. And then there's the ones and zeros aspect, as you said, but these are all abstraction on data that they're all valuable in and of themselves, right? Like 3D is one of them, right? 2D is another one. So this is like one of the cool new things that we're doing is to broaden the tent. There's a lot of like design directors and so on that can't engage with essentially the process because it's all happening in Revit and somewhere else. But just enabling them to like, wrap up their model on an iPad and start like redlining it, like with our initial testing, that was like amazing results. So hey, let's marry the two. Let's make sure that we can have the right abstraction for the right people, for the right at the right, whether it's 3D, whether it's 2D, whether it's ones and zeros, right?
Are the questions that people are asking around the table, do they sound different? So in other words, I appreciate maybe the question that a this or computational designer might sound like one thing, but let's say the ambition is to get the facilities folks or the project managers folks, like what are the kinds of questions and how do you think about that for all of the various folks around the table?
There's quite a varied amount of questions, obviously, right? And as you said, like that definition of cool is always different. Like as we were talking earlier, like that definition of cool is always different. Like what people are interested in, it's always different. But then once you have like a model inside Speckle, that's one of the beautiful parts. Like you can like basically drill it for any data that is in that model already. So you can start answering, let's say, FM's questions around like, how many units of this type do I have, for example? Or you can start answering questions for simple, cost estimations, like if you want to whip them out, or like material quantities and like, how did those material quantities evolve over time? Like, do we have more steel or less steel going on? So you can basically do each their own to a certain extent. And the beautiful part is like, it's also back in the day, this was part of my job. It was like, as a computational designer, I had to dig the data for all these questions, make it available, shape it, and so on. So that's something that we're, resolving to a certain extent.
Is there like a particular fork or project or something that a developer has built that stood out to you, like, or perhaps something that you wish people were working on? Yeah.
There are like many things that I'm going like, I wish we would have built that, right? And like we saw a recent example, like from whatever, like we can't mention the name, but what they've built is like they've integrated Speckle within they're developing their own internal like AI agent where you can just go on and say like, give me, a 3D model of this character from, I don't know what series or something like this cartoon character. And you tell it like, where have I used it before? And then it just surfaces up your model. And then you can say, can you please replace that thing with the other thing? And it would just like wrap in that model in and out, and all through like kind of a textual interface combined with essentially a 3D representation of that. And I was like, yeah, wow, that's cool. But yeah, like I need to stop myself from hacking too much.
Well, I guess it wouldn't be a technology podcast if I didn't obviously bring it up, but AI in general, both internally as well as just what you're saying with the community. What's true today that perhaps wasn't true 3 years ago?
I'm a more productive developer when I have the time to like do stuff. So that is definitely true. I'm still like, I don't know, maybe I'm slow, but sometimes I feel like, there are productive applications of AI out there in the world. I yet to have seen clear ones that are like very AEC specific, right? This is for me, like there are things I think much more valid that are maybe in your world around like, hey, this object is this thing. Like there's much more like reality capture probably that can get out of AI than, for example, when it comes to basically, yes, you can more easily interrogate the data inside the building, but is that really like something that needs like, I don't know, how many billions of research and investment? Or is that just like a more simple natural language processing thing? Or is it just statistics at the end of the day? Yeah, I don't know. How would you answer that question? Because like I always feel like I'm ending up in a bit of a reactionary camp on AEC and AI, and I don't like that.
Yeah. In terms of just like the impact of AI on the product or the company
pretty
building?
much so. Yeah, pretty much so. Like, I mean, we are enabling like our customers to like train their own models on top of their own design data, but it's stuff that we're staying out also for other reasons. But yeah.
There's a few frameworks that I found interesting. I am seeing from my end that when we work with owner operators that own or operate, manage lots of spaces, number one, I think it's a positive thing that owners are now asking questions and knowing that if they digitize their spaces, they can begin to query and ask questions of their space. That's a general positive thing that I didn't see even 3-4 years ago. Like big corporate brands asking like, hey, let's bring this stuff online and ask questions of it. I think that there is a difference between where people get excited versus where I think AI is going to make the most impact, at least in the short term. In our case, I'm obviously biased because we're often digitizing existing buildings.
Mhm.
And so I think about the using AI to be able to better understand what exists versus what should be, right? So I know
Mhm.
that there's a large part of the AI conversation in AEC is around the generative components.
Generative AI. Yeah.
Like you said, like, hey, using text or whatever it might be to suggest what a space could be. Where I'm actually most interested right now, that, and again, by way of just what we're being pressured by our clients, customers, is using AI to just better query and better understand like what is within these models.
Mhm.
And at a level of sophistication that isn't just like, hey, show me all doors, of course, but it's kind of like a multi-layered filtering that I think just becomes much easier with LLMs and things like that.
Yeah, makes sense.
But yeah, I'm a big believer. I think to better understand what should be, I think we have to first understand like what is
Is. Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
But again, that's kind of a fairly kind of an opinionated stance. But I think in our case, AI is interesting in so far as it just helps us better help answer for those
Mhm.
people around the table that aren't technical, but just need to ask questions of their
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree with that. I think, a big part of my disillusionment comes maybe from mostly as an architect, like it just like replaced Photoshop in many cases, like, the generative part, that's, the
Yeah,
flashy, hey, and
yeah.
I thought that that's like, okay, that's cool. I'll say it's cool, but it's like not that transformational, like world changing, industry changing impact that I would ideally strive for.
Right.
Right. But yeah.
I will say from an internal workflow, it's definitely made us move faster. I'm not convinced yet it's made us move more. Um, I think there's a difference between moving fast, moving efficiently. I think it's
Mhm.
allowed us to move very, very quickly in terms of just vibe coding and interfacing and just
Yeah.
mockups and that sort of thing. But as I'm sure you'd appreciate, it also introduces another challenge, which is like if you can move so quickly, it the amount of technical debt you accrue also speeds up very,
Yes.
very quickly. So
Yeah,
that we
you
haven't
can.
solved. If you have any advice, let me know.
No, I don't actually. But I've been having like a super like kind of interesting conversation with yeah, one of the employees at Speckle. Like he's been saying like, yeah, he's a good friend as well. Like he's been saying like, yeah, man, these days I feel bad because I don't write code with AI, and I'm like, dude, no, like chill, why? But there was this kind of like reverse problem of like he's also like our web graphics engineer, so like there's less vibe coding you can do in web graphics essentially, rather than like
Exactly.
just
Exactly.
front end and shit like this. It's more like hardcore science. And he was feeling bad for like not writing code with AI, and I was like, dude, what are you talking about? Like, yeah, you ask chat GPT or whatever a bunch of questions, you get inspired or maybe not, but you parse what you do, right? Because we've had internally cases of yeah, what you said was very true. Like we just moved faster and broke more things.
Yep. 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 I'm sure at certain points, like that's gonna calibrate and we're gonna build the right guardrails. But in the short term, it's a hot mess. It's just like I mean, you'd appreciate this, right? As you work with other team members, setting up the right guardrails is
It's important. Yeah,
yeah, it's a challenge. Question for you. So you're on
sure.
the front lines of really exciting community. What are you most excited about right now in the next 12 months, 18 months? Give
Mm.
us a kind of a sneak peek into what kinds of problems and opportunities you're keeping you up.
You're catching me at a bad time because right now, like next week, we have our, let's say we have our community conference in London, like SpeckleCon next Friday.
Nice.
And basically I can't see anything beyond that, right? Like
Okay,
it's a
okay.
mess of like, oh my God, all these people are coming over. We need to be there. Like, is the deck ready? Like, do we have everything in place? Is the, catering paid for? So there's that chaos that I'm just like, both looking very much forward to like being there and like it happening, but also very much looking forward to like what's coming after, in a sense. In terms of, I think for us, what's really exciting right now is that I see us more and more, like before we're struggling a lot to push this message that Speckle's a data layer. Like it's not just like a nice viewer and like a nice dashboarding tool or like an interoperability tool. It's also this message that actually, ones and zeros, zeros and ones, and having your designs represented as such is like valuable for you, is resonating more and more, like increasingly also with GCs. And that's like actually something that's very exciting for me. And as us being able to like kind of grow our adoption inside construction and like kind of engaging with the problems. And I think to prefix this, like historically, like I'm an architect, a bunch of us are former architects and engineers. Like we were very much, let's say, experts in the AE space. And now we're engaging with construction, which is like kind of like a super exciting space to be in, right? Problems are essentially more real. There's less stuff about like designs and door handles, and it's more stuff about like getting stuff built. So
Heck yeah.
that's what's actually like I'm really looking forward to, because that's where Speckle's getting adopted as a data layer. And this is where like we can actually play some actually cool, like we can start delivering some like cool ROI for our clients. Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No.
So
Well, exciting. And I know you're not going to do it, but you should plug the conference coming up. For those that might be listening, I think
yes,
Mitchell's going to be too shy to do it, but I'm going to force him to. What can folks look out for? Like, what can they expect without revealing too much? And of course,
I think, basically it's like, what can I say? Like, depends on, it's like it's a place where basically a bunch of AEC folks get together, like and talk about like data and designing things and building things. That's how I describe it in a nutshell. So like, if you all are interested in like, joining such a conversation and seeing like how other companies like, I don't know, Gensler, Pomerleau, Suffolk are dealing with these problems, like that's a place to be. Generally, it's not, we have like a 20-minute keynote presentation about Speckle, and then the rest is like users and clients and customers talking about stuff they're doing. So it's a nice venue. There's also possibly like Martin Day. I don't know if you know Martin Day from AC Mac is sharing our panel, and that might be a bit of a controversial end of day around like how our vendors, possibly even us, like, I don't know if he's gonna put us on the spot, but like, how are vendors inside AC like helping users or not helping users like do more with their data. Yeah, that's SpeckleCon. Plus food, drinks, gossip, the usual.
yeah. Well, before we have, you've taken us on a journey navigating the community that you and the team have been able to foster, the product that you guys are launching, the challenges that AEC is facing. If you could go back and tell PhD Dimitri before he started all this, now having the benefit of hindsight of the community, of technology
Mm.
evolving, of company building, what would you tell him?
Oh, wow. I think I would have told him to have a kid earlier, possibly. I think that would have been
It's the most advice I've heard. I love it.
yeah, like in a sense, I don't know, like hey, pause Dimitri, if you're serious about this thing of being a father, like you should probably do it earlier rather than later. So, but yeah, no, beyond this kind of life advice, I think, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe start asking for money earlier, because I think we've been taken for granted for a long time, and like actually, having a commercial open source project, becoming a company, it's quite a stretch. So yeah, that's something definitely, at least to, let's say, not necessarily former me, but like any future founders in the space. I think it's always good to test your idea like on all fronts, whether they are like political, technological, as well as commercial.
So in other words, you would have thought you actually could have been fundable much sooner than I think
Yeah,
it took you to.
yeah, totally, absolutely, yes. And I think that could have accelerated a lot of like the product development and stuff. So maybe actually the advice, actually, now that I'm talking about it, is like, man, drop out, start a company.
All right, you heard it there. For those listening, and you heard it straight from the man himself. So
Yeah, hope my
that's fun.
mom's not listening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Your parents upset with that advice, but it's worked out for quite well for some. So,
true.
Dimitri, really appreciate your time, man. I know it's a Friday, it's later for you, but I'm really grateful for the conversation. And I know those listening in, I think they look at you as a kind of an aspirational figure, not just in what
Mm,
you're doing in terms of the movement, but also in terms of company building and just your approach. So, I trust it was very fruitful, certainly for
yeah,
me.
definitely. It was a very good conversation. Thanks for having me, Jose.